Peter, is that you? The Samsung? No.
No, it was really my thumb drive.
No.
Oh.
I'm thinking that someone is logged onto Zoom. Is there anyone on the Zoom online that can tell me whether they can hear me? Dr. Samsung. I did test the microphone and everything, so it should be working. I just like
This is
to,
recorded, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you'll just need to turn it on when you're ready to.
Can you do that? Oh, just do.
Yeah. And Steve, when you introduce them, do you want to do it here? I can give you the.
I'll just do it.
Yeah, okay. Cool.
It's just like,
Still got a few minutes. I don't think I need to tell you anything else. It's all set up. When we do the question and answer, I'll run around with them. All the question and answer.
yep.
Cool.
Thanks you.
Turn the lights down even lower. Get the best of your colours. Yep.
Yeah, that's on the calendar. Yeah, that's good. Well, I didn't take it out. It was one of my study items. Yeah, so the day. Yeah, but it's one of my. It's actually juvenile that I released. It's more activity. Yeah, it doesn't look like juvenile. That same in. Yeah, something like that.
It is.
Tiny little.
Okay. But we're getting an echo. Or we were when I was sitting down there.
But the next photo is the biggest I've ever seen. Wow, monstrous. Really cool. What's the next slide? Seen dozens and dozens. So that is. In fact, you walk through the bush. It's really strange. So.
But like the.
You just straighten the wheel off. Sorry.
Yeah,
it's just like saying, are you totally distracted?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Yeah.
11:30, or you want to give me a minute?
That's a team.
Wait.
Yeah, we are. We don't.
Yeah, they certainly have, you know, large population that have these somewhat populations, you know, sort of show. But
Yeah.
It's really weird.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, in the absence of like any boundary barriers, you can really see still. Actually, it's got to do with geology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, as really fussy about trees I've used.
Must be reptile.
They're really fussy. And
I do, but.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Maybe a little less complicated. But certainly it's not.
At least in theory, you can expand the habitats to illustrate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well.
yeah.
Expand habitat.
yeah. I'm interested, I'm really interested to see it, because I don't know the story.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming. Gives me great pleasure to introduce Ben Croak, who's from the ST government and a really valued collaborator with several people in the University of Canberra. So Ben got his BSc from the University of New England in Armdale, and then went to Sydney Uni, where he worked with Rick Shine on these broad-headed snakes and what he's going to talk about today, and also one of their major prey items, the far more beautiful velvet geckos. Since then, he's worked as a consultant and researcher, including a stint as a research fellow at Stockholm University, working with European adders, European grass snakes, newt species, and a suite of invertebrates. Currently, he's working with the ACT environmental offsets as a grassland ecologist with a focus on endangered species, with particular emphasis on golden sun moths, striped lizards, and of course, the grassland Aeolus dragons. And his current focus is the grassland Aeolus dragons and their conservation there, with a particular emphasis on reintroductions into the wild from captive bred populations. And he's a co-supervisor of a couple of our PhD students, Jess Thompson and Ryan Colley. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ben Croak.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, like Steve said, I did my PhD at Sydney Uni, primarily on this guy, the broad-headed snake, highly endangered snake that's only found in the Sydney Basin. It's an elapid, which means it's a front-fanged venomous snake. This is a really large one. So what I'm going to talk about largely is the critical habitat for this species. If you see this, just take note now, you can see that this bedrock here is a different color to this over here, and there's a reason for that, and I'm going to talk a lot about that soon. So life history of broad-headed snakes. They've got really small populations, and they've got a really restricted population range. They're found only in the Sydney Basin, but they're really patchy throughout the Sydney Basin. You can imagine the city of Sydney was a big problem for these guys in terms of fragmentation. They do persist in the sandstone outcrops around Sydney. They've got really late maturation compared to other snake species. They live in a really low energy environment. It's hard to gather energy. They could be up to 4 years old before they reproduce once, and it might be another 4 years before they reproduce again. And they only usually have about 4 babies at a time. So an individual that's 8 years old might have only had 4 babies in its lifetime. They've got high adult survival, which means most of the juveniles don't make it to adulthood. Most juveniles that are born are picked off early in life. And it's only those few adults that make it through to adulthood, those few individuals that make it through to adulthood, that perpetuate the populations. So removing just a few adults from the system can be absolutely detrimental for this species. They've got a low reproductive output, which I mentioned already. They've got low juvenile dispersal, so the juveniles tend not to disperse far away from their natal sites. And they've got really, really high habitat specificity, and that's what I'm going to talk about mostly. Now, if you know much about endangered species, you can tell that all of these life traits make it vulnerable to being endangered or going extinct. All of its life traits pretty much work against it. So, like I said, the habitat, restoration of habitat was the focus of my PhD. They do have 2 prime habitats. In the summer, they live in tree hollows in adjacent woodlands. And in the winter, they live on the rock outcrops. And that was the focus of my work, was these rocky outcrops around the Sydney Basin. So this is what a typical outcrop where you'll find broadheads in the cooler parts of the year looks like. This one's in Morton National Park. You can see up the top, there's all these rocks that the snakes live on. You find a bunch of animals up on these outcrops, lots of opportunistic species like copper-tailed skinks, small-eyed snakes, Huntsman spiders, and white skinks. You'll find them on the outcrops, but you'll also find them in the adjacent woodlands. Unique to these outcrops, though, are several species that are found only on the outcrops and nowhere else. Broad-headed snakes, I mean, they do move to the woodlands in the summer, but in the winter, they're exclusively on the outcrops. Its main prey item, velvet geckos. These flat rock spiders and these flat roaches are just examples of animals that are found only there. One thing all these guys have got in common is they're extremely dorsoventrally flattened. They're highly specialized for living in tight rocky crevices. These spiders, when you turn them on the side, are literally maybe 2 or 3 millimeters thick, side onways. So they're incredibly flattened. Broad-headed snakes get their name from their broad head. It's flattened and it's like a chisel, and they use it to wedge into tight spaces. So you've got a bunch of different rock types up on these outcrops. You've got these scattered large bush rocks. These are useful for opportunistic species, but these are not the rocks that these habitat specialists are using up there. It's this type of rock that's kind of unique to the Sydney system that breaks away. If you could see this gigantic shield, it's broken away over geological time, through fires, through ecosystem engineers like ants getting under there, things like that. So this habitat forms over geological time. It's much slower than growing a forest. It's essentially non-renewable. And it's these crevices where these guys live. And in the winter, these crevices are really relatively warm. They provide a stable thermal environment for these ectotherms to live in. So here, for example, is a broad-headed snake I got out from under a rock. I'll explain this because it's a little bit hard to visualize, but you can see this groove here, and you can see this rock here. That rock's actually broken in half, and that's sort of inside of the rock. You can see how the rock conforms to the substrate. That's where these animals live, and believe it or not, a snake like that gets under that crevice like that. And when you turn these rocks over, they often look like they've been crushed. They squash themselves down so tightly in there. You turn the rock over, it looks like a squashed snake, and then it puffs up and starts hissing and carrying on. So it's they're really well adapted to fitting in these tight crevices. So this is another view of the same rock. This was the edge of the rock you could see before. This is where the snake was sitting before I put the rock back in place. I'm letting the snake go back under the rock. It took about 40 minutes for it to work its way back into that crevice. So that's how tight it is and how well they can fit into them. So as you can probably guess, the threat to this system and to broad-headed snakes is bush rock removal. Like I said, it's non-renewable. It forms over geological time, especially the rocks that they use. It interacts with their vulnerable traits, that high habitat specificity. They need that tight rock. And the fact that there's small populations and ranges that are patchy throughout their ranges. So I've gone looking for populations of these guys. I've walked through the bush over outcrops, not found them. And then you come to one outcrop and you'll find 20 snakes on one outcrop. And so a bush rock, someone stealing bush rock, picks that wrong outcrop and strips that one outcrop of bush rock. That's the whole habitat for a population like that just gone. So bush rock removals are identified as a leading threat to the persistence of broad-headed snakes. And so I thought that I would spend my PhD looking at a way to try and recreate these rocks and restore habitat for broad-headed snakes and the associated assemblages that live under them. So here's an example of a scar. And that's why I said in that first picture, if you notice the different color in the rock, that big broad-headed snake in that first photo, I'd taken the rock away and you could see this pink sort of bit where the exfoliation sits. And you can see where all the weathering is occurring on the outside. So that would have been good habitat for something to live under, but it's gone. This is where it ends up. So this is a nursery
And this is about, I think, something like 6 kilometers away from the largest population of broadheaded snakes that we know about. You can see lots of big boulders, but you can also see these stacks of these exfoliations. So they're targeting exfoliations as well as just general bush rocks. And you can go to these nurseries on any given day and see pallets like that. The laws are very, of course, you can't take them from national parks, but the laws are very different around private land and different areas. So it's hard to actually protect the habitat outside of those areas that have that legislation. This is where it ends up. As you can imagine, it's in suburbia. No use really to anyone. Might look nice, but it's yeah, quite a waste of resources. Okay, so this is where I came in, and if anyone's interested in reading about this first part, it's in this paper that I published in Animal Behaviour. How do you make artificial rocks? So the first thing that we wanted to understand was what the crevice configuration looked like under these rocks, and what was sort of a nice crevice for a snake. And I had the advantage, I was able to go to these sites that had been supervised by my supervisors for, I think, over a decade before I started. And so my supervisor was able to tell me this rock always has broadheads under it. This rock never has had one. This one always has geckos. So I was able to go through and know quite a lot of the history of all the rocks on these outcrops. And so what we did was we wanted to quantify the crevice structure. So we got these rocks, wrapped them in plastic to protect them, put expandable foam on the bottom, put a drop sheet down, put the rocks back into place, and held them down while they set. And then what we had was a bunch of crevices, casts of crevices that were from, like I said, 3 types of rocks that were never used, rocks that were used by snakes, and rocks that were used by geckos. So that left me with crevices, but I still needed to quantify them. I went back to the literature and found that some crevice work had been done on geckos, and the geckos preferred crevices that were about 4 to 6 millimeters thick. I caught a bunch of broadheads and I took them to the lab, and I looked at them. I offered them different crevices chocked up with pavers, and I found if they couldn't get in, it was too small. If they shot right through, I judged that as too big. If they went inside these crevices and curled up, I thought that was a pretty good sign that was what they would like. And the stats told us that 6 to 11 millimeters is what broadheaded snakes prefer. So anything less than a gap of 4 millimeters was too small, and greater than 11 millimeters was too big. So that's the sort of width range we were looking at that we thought was suitable for the reptiles. And so I went back to the casts and I started quantifying them. So this is a cast of a really good snake rock. I've just color coded it for ease. The green is the area that falls within that width range of 4 to 11. And the red is outside that. It's either too small or too big. And so it became apparent really quickly that the ones they were using had a lot more green than red on them. Here's one that wasn't so good. This rock would have been one that had never been used by any of these target species. So we were able to come up with what we wanted the underside of the rocks to look like. And so I made over about 1,500 of these in the end. And what we did was we created, this is kind of offset these two areas. We had to put them on flat ground to try and keep them uniform. We put this foam tape in setting grooves, and this tape compresses under the rock's weight. And what it did was effectively made a crevice that was about 4 to 6 here and about 6 to 11 here millimeters when you place them out. The trick was finding enough flat ground, but we managed. So here's one of the artificial rocks on site. And so that leads me up to the next phase of this, which we published this work in Restoration Ecology, was testing how well these rocks worked. We needed to be able to not only mimic the crevice configuration that they wanted, but there was no point doing this without being able to mimic or reproduce the thermal regimes that they experience under these rocks. So I placed 1,200 of these out. I placed them in areas that we already know broadheaded snakes like. So on sun-exposed western aspect, outcrops of western aspect. That is to catch the afternoon sun, of course. Now, these are effectively standardized units. We were able to put out over 1,000 standardized units, and we're able to use these to ask further questions, which I'm going to talk about next. But right now, I'll just talk about how well they work. But just keep in mind that these are now standardized units based on sun exposure, aspect, crevice configuration, and thermal regime. So I quantified the crevice and the thermal regime. I did that by doing the expandable foam strip with these. So then I took foam casts of these artificial rocks that I could then compare to the foam casts I took of the reptile rocks and the unused rocks. We measured the thermal regime and we monitored the colonization by invertebrates and vertebrates. So this was a rock deployment day. I went through many a volunteer carrying these through the bush out onto the outcrops. It was hard work. So here's some of the results of comparing the casts of the artificial rocks to those casts I took from the natural rocks. So you can see that in terms of the area, is that correct? Yeah, so that's just the size of the rocks, really. So you can see that these rocks were about the same sort of size as the rocks that broadhead snakes were using. They were a bit bigger than the rocks that geckos would use, but we were aiming for snakes to use them. So that was a pretty good outcome. But the area that was suitable for reptiles, so that area that was green on my casts, didn't differ among artificial snake and gecko rocks, but was very different to what was found under unused rocks. So we were able to replicate that crevice configuration really well. Number of openings, there was so the discrete openings again also matched the sort of number of openings that went into the hollows that were used by snakes and geckos, was similar to the artificial rocks and different to unused. That all important thermal regime. You can see here that the thermal, we used eye buttons under a heap of artificial rocks and a heap of natural rocks that were used by reptiles. And you can see that thermal regime tracked really nicely. It didn't differ significantly. So we were able to mimic the thermal regimes as well. So how well did it work? It actually worked really well. We found the percentage of rocks that we used increased really rapidly. I mean, that includes inverts, and you'd expect inverts to get under these things, regardless of how you made them. But when we break it down a bit into inverts, lizards, and snakes, you can see that, yeah, the inverts species went up really quickly. Within 4 weeks, we had our first geckos, and within, I think, 32 weeks, we had every single lizard known to be on the outcrops living under, had been recorded under an artificial rock. 28 weeks, we found our first snake, and it was a broad-headed snake, which was really cool. And by 36 weeks, we had every snake known on the outcrops living under artificial rocks. They actually really contested property amongst velvet geckos. And I'm going to talk a bit further later on about the effect this had on geckos. But so I first put out 200 rocks in my honours. The rest came out in my PhD or just before my PhD. Of those 200 rocks, by 56 weeks, we recorded 250 territorial geckos using 200 rocks, which means, to me, it seems like they were fighting for them. They were kicking each other out to record 250 individuals under 200 rocks. And they are highly territorial. They do not like being around each other. So the geckos really found them to be quite property. So just some nice pictures of stuff living under them. This is a colony of polyrachus ants, a nomadic type of ant. This is a small-eyed snake. So these are some generalist animals, a small-eyed snake, and some more specialized ones, a flat cockroach, flat rock spider. There is a rock. There was a rock next to that. There were thousands of these things, and they're awful. And yeah, velvet gecko, and most importantly, broad-headed snakes. So to get the broad-headed snakes under the rocks was really cool because they are really site fidelic. They come back and use the same rocks year after year. You'll tag the same animals, you'll recapture the same animal under the same rock year after year. So to get them to actually switch up and start using different rocks, our artificial rocks, is really cool. Okay, so like I said before, the artificial rocks was standardized units. So we're able to look at the artificial rocks and look at who was using artificial rocks, which rocks were getting used the most, which weren't getting used at all. And we're able to tell a lot more about habitat preference for a lot of species that were using the rocks. So like I said, standardized units based on sunlight exposure aspect and now thermal regime and crevice configuration. I went out and I measured a heap of abiotic variables in relation to all the rocks. So I measured the distance to the nearest crevice, the woodland, the nearest natural rock, the west-facing cliff, leaf litter, measured the size of the outcrop, nearest natural rock, and also the solar radiation received by each rock using gap load analyzer. And we use generalized linear models for each species, which gives us a positive or negative coefficient, which indicates the direction of the effect. That just means a positive relationship with sunlight means they preferred more sunlight. A negative one would mean that they preferred less. And we did this so we used RC weighting to identify the important variables for each species. And we did this 2 ways. We did rocks that were either used or, so whether a rock had been used once or never used, so a binomial distribution. And we also did this for rocks that we used multiple times. So we looked at whether they were used or not, and then we looked at the ones that we used, how often they were used, to tell us what it was about these rocks that was attractive to these different animals. Now we looked at this for heaps of them. I'm just going to talk about the 3 most interesting. So obviously velvet geckos, broad-headed snakes, and interesting enough, I've included an opportunistic species here, wall skinks. You find them on the outcrops, but you also find them in suburbia. You find them in Sydney on people's walls. So these guys don't seem that fussy about their habitat. But in terms of this, it seems like they were almost as fussy as these habitat specialists, which was really interesting. But I'll get to that. So what we found was that geckos were, so in used versus unused rocks, geckos were choosing rocks that had received lots of solar radiation, were close to the west-facing cliff, and liked to be on large outcrops. And it all makes sense with their biology. They like to be hotter. The west-facing cliff is probably an escape route for predation and things like that. And they like to be on large outcrops because they're territorial and they don't want to be around other members of their own species. But when we looked at the ones that they repeatedly used, we found a heap more stuff. So what additionally fell out? So the bottom is, yes. So they also like to be nearest to a crevice, which could be a predation response. They like to be close to the woodland, which is also, they forage on little insects that come out of the woodland. So they're picking their rocks that are closer to where their prey sources are. And they also like to be far away from other rocks, again, to stay away from their territorial neighbor. So by having these rocks as standardized units, we're really able to understand in depth what geckos are looking for in their preference for rocks. So the similar story for wall skinks, like I said, this was really interesting that this same sort of pattern fell out for wall skinks. They showed a huge preference for different variables, different to the geckos, but they have different needs. You know, they don't want to be close to the woodland where they can be preyed on by centipedes and things like that. They like to be close to the cliff, far from the cliff. They like to have, close to the cliff, and they like, increasing solar radiation and things like that. Oh, excuse me. So it was really, I thought that was a really interesting find that opportunistic species are being so fussy. Broad-headed snakes, we found that they like to be close to the cliff and they like to be far from the litter. They're really fussy about the rocks they'll be under. If there's any detritus under there, they won't be under there. So they like to be far from the leaf litter. They like to be close to the cliff. I think that's probably a thermoregulative strategy. If it gets too hot, they can escape down the face of the cliff. We didn't find any pattern with repeated use of broad-headed rocks, which suggests to us we'd probably done a pretty good job of making a rock that they really like. So moving on to how well the artificial rocks work. So we were now towards the end of my PhD, I was getting to the point where I could start looking at some of the long-term effects that the artificial rocks had on geckos. We now have enough data on broad-headed snakes, but I don't have that all assembled. But this work on geckos was published in the Journal of Applied Ecology. So velvet geckos, they're very cute. Main prey item for broad-headed snakes. So to assess how well the artificial rocks worked, I assessed and compared velvet geckos caught under natural rocks versus ones that lived under artificial rocks. And I looked at growth rates. I looked at the different sex and age classes, and I looked at the parent survival using program Mark. So the first thing that came out was that the growth rates didn't differ, which was a really good finding. The geckos were growing just as well in natural rocks as they were in the artificial rocks. So we weren't throwing anything out of balance there. And Yep, I just said all that. The demography was also really interesting in that we found a lot more animals under artificial rocks than we did under natural rocks. But the interesting and the good thing is that they are roughly in the same proportions. So males, less females, and more juveniles, but you can see those bar graphs are kind of in the same proportions. So we weren't throwing out the demographics of the species too much by putting artificial rocks out. Yeah, so I just said that as well. And the survival, this was really interesting, the survival of the geckos using program mark. This says that survival was based on group. So survival differed between males, females, and juveniles. And the probability of recapture was based on time, which makes sense because you don't catch them in the summer. You only catch them in the winter. I was only sampling in the winter. And they don't really they go deeper into the crevices and stuff in the summer. You can't really catch them. But what we found was there wasn't a difference in survival between males using artificial rocks and natural rocks. I think we were capturing the same individuals because of that territorial behavior. We almost picked up a trend with females, and probably more data that difference would have been significant. There would have been greater survival under artificial rocks, but certainly it was significantly more juveniles surviving under artificial rocks than natural rocks. So that right? Yep. So, and I think it's just a function of there being more quality habitat out there, allowing animals not to disappear from the system more readily. So, yeah, so the males are territorial and exclude each other in maturation, and you catch the same dominant individuals repeatedly. Juveniles displace each other on maturity, and with less habitat at unrestored sites, they were vanishing from the system more readily. Females potentially show higher survival at restoration sites, though it's not significant due to the availability of quality habitat. So that's all the work that I did on artificial rocks. From this work, we were able to alter the management guidelines or the action plans for this species to include this as a method of restoring habitat for the species. All this work that I did and that has been done previously was done in the south for this species. And this species actually has an evolutionary unit in the north. So all the threats that have been identified, the destruction of habitat, removal of surface rock, which I've been talking about. There's also a bunch of others like altered fire regimes resulting in overshading, urbanization and poaching. I mentioned briefly how bad poaching for this species can be. And that led to a bunch of management strategies, the artificial habitat restoration that I've talked about, the maintenance of hollow-bearing forest adjacent to outcrops, removal of vegetation overgrowth, and locking of gates in areas. But like I said, all this work had been done in the south of the range. And so I thought in the sort of last part of my PhD, I really wanted to understand whether these management strategies that we developed through all this research were also applicable to animals in the north. And so I set out and I caught, so this is where all the work's been done. This is actually the range of the species, and this is where the break in the species occurs. So this is a northern significant evolutionary unit, and this is a southern one. So you can see largely it's not represented in the research that's been done. So yeah, southern, northern, and the sister species is Stevens banded snake, which I'm going to talk about as well. So this is the last paper I'm talking about. This comes from a radiotelemetry study I did that was published in PLOS One. And like I said, this is where the location of this study was, in the extreme north of the range of the species. And there's heaps of reasons to think that management needed to be different in the north to the south. There's different tree species, there's different vegetation structures, there's different prey species, there's different geological compositions, and most importantly, there's different temperatures. It's a lot warmer up there on the other side of Sydney. Also, here's just some photos just to show. So I went up onto these outcrops in the north and I walked over lots and lots of outcrops and I found some new populations of snakes. And I caught a bunch and I caught them in winter under the rocks and I brought them home or back to the lab and kept them till summer to be implanted with radio transmitters for tracking. So here's the surgical procedure of one of the snakes getting implanted. So they cut a slit at this end and a slit at this end in the body cavity and slid these giant forceps things up. grabbed hold of the radio tag and pulled them all the way back through and sewed them up. It was quite a thing to watch, but they woke up, they were fine. I didn't lose one snake. I was able to recatch them and get them to take the transmitters back out again. One snake extracted that itself. I was tracking a snake and I came to a rock and there's just the transmitter under the rock. And I found the snake a couple of rocks down with a big hole in its side. It actually pulled it out itself, which is amazing. I just took it back and put another one in it. So when I tracked these snakes, I followed them across the landscape. I followed their movement. I created home range polygons. And I tracked them to the trees they were using, and I quantified the tree they were using, and I quantified 5 random trees around each tree. So I looked at the hollows, the height of the tree, the species of the tree, the diameter of the tree, diameter breast height, which is the standard way of measuring it, the hollow temperature where possible with eye buttons, and I also looked at rocks that they had been using when I caught them earlier in the winter. So I looked at the size and the crevice temperature. So the first thing I found was that they were the same as snakes in the south. They were exhibiting the same habitat shift, summer and winter, and it was thermally driven. You can see rocks in the summer are really hot, whereas in the winter, they're kind of nice, about 30 degrees. And trees in the winter are really cold, but they're kind of nice in the summer. So that shift again is thermally driven. As I said, I tracked them across these valleys. The distance they moved didn't really differ to those in the south. The distance per move didn't really differ to the south, but what did differ was this interval between moves. This was quite different. They were sequestering themselves for up to 8 days in the trees, whereas in the south, they were moving every 3 days on average. And so I went back to the literature, and sure enough, Stevens banded snake, the sister species, does this 8-day movement at this time of year as well. So they were starting to behave like the sister species in the north of their range. And I should have said on that other map that I showed you, where broadheads stop, Stevens banded snakes pretty much start. There's almost, they probably do overlap a bit in that interchange zone. There was also a bunch of behavioural differences. They were using leaf litter as refugia. They were basking overtly on the sides of trees like this one. They were in branches and on logs. And these are all things that Stevens banded snakes do that broad-headed snakes don't do in the south. So this was pretty interesting that they were behaving a lot like this. This Northern Evolutionary Unit was behaving a lot like its sister species in many ways. So I crunched all this data that I'd taken on these different trees, and I found that using generalized linear mixed models, we found that the most important variables were the diameter. They liked trees that were really big in diameter. They liked trees with lots of hollows, and they liked trees that were really short, which is the complete opposite to the snakes in the south. They were up in these really giant trees. So that again was a different sort of behavioural thing they were doing. There were also observations I made that there was multiple use of a very few trees. I tracked snakes to, and these trees, a lot of these trees appeared really burnt, like they'd been burnt in fires, or they'd even looked like they'd been struck by lightning, some of them, to break them apart, but they were still alive, but they had lots of hollows. The whole trunk on these were hollow almost, but they were still living trees. They weren't killed by the lightning or the fire. But there were 3 of these trees, and I tracked a bunch of snakes. I tracked 2 different snakes to the same tree, the first one, and I looked up in this tree, and there was about 8 broad-headed snakes up in the branches, which was really quite astounding, because you look around and they're not anywhere else. And I tracked them to another tree, one snake to another tree, and again, it was the same thing. There was a heap of broad-headed snakes up in the branches. And then there was another tree like that I tracked them to, but I didn't see any broadheads in that, up in those branches. But the fact that I tracked 2 snakes to one tree was pretty telling that they seem to be about as fussy as the trees they use as they are with the rocks that they'll get under. So that was a really good finding too. So here's the home range polygons. And the immediate thing that stood out here was you've got 5 different types of vegetation. And if you look at these polygons, they're sticking exclusively to two of them. They don't use these other types of, they don't even actually pass through them. They're sticking completely to these two types, which was really, really interesting. So I thought I was finished with field work, but then I saw that and had to go back out and find out what was different about these different vegetation types. And what I found straight away, it took me one day, was that the diameter breast height of these ones in those two used types were much bigger than in those other types, than the other three types, and the same of the number of hollows. So it must be the soil or the geology that's driving these trees that makes these trees really good for broad-headed snakes. So we're able to incorporate that into the management of the species as well in the north. So in conclusion, the broadheads in the north exhibited that seasonal shift. They had specific vegetation types that they preferred. They used multiple use of a few trees, and they showed similar behavioural traits to Stephen Bander snakes. And the management practices for Stevens Bander snakes were able to incorporate into the management plan for the species in the north. That's it. I'll just acknowledge my supervisors, Rick and Jono. They were great supervisors for my PhD, and we had a lot of funding from various bodies. So that's it.
So we've got plenty of time for questions.
Really great work. I've actually come across some of your rocks.
Oh yeah,
Doing some work on Rosenberg's monitors.
whereabouts?
Around Morton.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I had is, did you publish your protocol for your artificial rocks, or
that was the first.
Okay, that's in the first paper. Yeah. I'd be really interested in applying some of that with bigger sized rocks for the use with Rosenbergs, because I noticed that the juvenile monitors use very similar sized rocks, but it's in slightly different orientation and conditions.
Yeah.
But it's really awesome work that you did. Did you play around with trying to get like the different thermal properties of the rocks? What did you do to mimic the thermal properties of the natural rock?
We've tried a bunch of different materials, and we ended up settling on fiber reinforced cement was the one that produced. So we put out a bunch of sandstone out in the sun and a bunch of these different types of, so like we had concrete, the straight concrete fiber reinforced, we had fiberglass, we had a bunch of different things, and we looked at the one that created the most similar thermal regime as to the sandstone.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's all I had, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so that, if you send me your email address, I can send you the paper if you want to. Yeah.
Okay.
Just a quick follow-up on that. To hit the right temperature, was that just adjusting the level of fiberglass in the matrix, or?
It's adjusting the thickness of the rocks. So how thick? So we took a natural rock and took a mold of it, and we just basically messed around with how thick the rock was. Based on the thermal data that we knew was good for broadheads. Yep.
Hi, thanks, very interesting. I wanted to ask about, so you put, for like the geckos, if the population is limited by a number of suitable crevice sites, presumably you could put out heaps of these artificial rocks and you could increase the population of geckos, but you then expect sort of, flow-on effects on other species. And I just wondered whether you thought about that or
we did. We didn't find anything detrimental because the rocks also provided habitat for the prey species for the gecko. So there's all these invertebrates, all these different things that were able to sustain the geckos that were at these sites. So we didn't find any detrimental effects of increasing the population. We watched them really closely. We measured their weights. We kept a good eye on whether we were exceeding carrying capacity. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think even changing the invertebrate communities as well, and then changing what those invertebrates are eating. You might increase the invertebrate communities, but if they're eating something, or they will be eating something, then change decomposition rates or grazing rates of vegetation and
Yeah,
so
we
on?
haven't found any negative effects of doing it yet. There's still students looking at these rocks now today. So, and we've found that the gecko populations are stable. The snake populations are relatively stable. And we haven't really detected any adverse effects, any flow-on effects like exceeding carrying capacity or or changing the invertebrate structure or anything like that.
Thanks. I'm enjoying watching you work. No, it was really good, but I was wondering a couple of things. Seemed like, were you saying there was basically a gecko per outcrop? That seems incredibly low per rock.
Yeah,
okay, so it doesn't matter how many of these artificial shelters you put out, you will increase the number of geckos.
Yeah.
And you said that just then that the snake populations are stable. Are they stable or growing, or like, I mean, is the amount of habitat available actually increasing because of this program, or is it just keeping pace with the destruction, basically?
Well, the snakes are using the rocks, and we have detected more snakes because of that. Whether the snake population is increasing or not would be something I'd have to go and look at again. So I haven't looked at this data since I finished my PhD, but I know Jono's kept going with it. He keeps monitoring the restoration sites. So I think he's got a pretty good idea. I can find out more about it. I actually contacted him to try and find out a bit more before I came today, but I didn't get hold of him. But he would certainly know the answer to that.
Just with the southern population, I know you're saying that the geckos are quite territorial, but did you ever find more than one snake under the same rock?
No.
So do you think in the north that there's any sort of sociality going on, or do you just think it's like a tolerance based on the limited habitat that they're sort of multiple? Like, do they have any aggression towards each other? Or?
They didn't seem to have any aggression towards each other, the ones I saw. I think it's just, actually, I shouldn't say that I have seen two snakes under one rock now that I think about it. I think they will just tolerate each other at that time of the year when they're up in those. I suspect they do a lot of, they eat a lot of small mammals and birds and things like that time of the year, and they're probably all not hungry and, willing to tolerate each other. It's also mating season. So
yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Just wondering about the ones in the north as well.
Yep.
Do you have a hypothesis for why you're finding all these snakes in these specific trees? Like, is it a thermal thing, or?
I think it would probably be a thermal thing. Yeah, I don't really know. There was just something about those trees that they really seem to like, the hollows. I can't really explain why they're in large numbers together like that.
Yeah.
They weren't in any sort of mating ball like you see diamond pythons and things like that do, which are in the same range. It definitely would warrant further. And it's not to say they're not doing that in the south, but they're just in much taller. You could never see them in the south when they were radio tracked down there, because they are up in gigantic trees down there. Yeah, they were kind of choosing a different type of tree. Again, it's probably thermal. It's a lot hotter in the north, so they're probably under trees that have got a bit of dapple, so they're not getting hit by the direct sunlight. Whereas in the south, they're probably getting more direct sunlight because it's colder down there.
Yeah, and perhaps the fact that they were burnt could change the characteristic as well. So
it seemed like the fact that they were burnt had changed them in some sort of way that would really appeal to the snakes. Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah, it's weird, but it's interesting too. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any more questions in here before I go to the chat? No. Okay.
Oh, burn. Yeah, so can Burn hear me? I can imagine he can.
Yeah.
We've got market captured geckos that are over 20 years old as well. So they're really long lived, the velvet geckos. So yeah, when Jono started his PhD, I don't know what year it was, but it was a long time ago. We were still catching animals that he marked in his PhD. So yeah, really long lived.
Okay. If we don't have any questions online or in the room, please join me in thanking Ben for a really great talk.